This is the man from Modesto. Yesterday I read this vlog story and it really alarmed me. And it alarmed me because of an experience that I had when I was in Slaviansk. And so now this second article establishes a pattern of Russian disinformation. The Russians are going to be putting out increasing amounts of disinformation, not just the Russian Times news, but through all kinds of media outlets. And they're all trying to deceive people, to deceive their own people, to raise them up, to participate in this world war they are now starting, but also to throw off some people who might try to resist them, saying, well, you know, they're justified. No, you have to understand the Russians, since long before the Cold War, were masters of disinformation and psychological ruse. So, what happened in Slaviansk, and then I'm going to get into this vlog article that I saw recently. So when I worked in Slaviansk, one day everyone's walking around wearing breathing filters. And so I asked, why is this? And I found out that there was a scare going around, that a bunch of people had heard that people were dropping like flies, dying everywhere, that there was some kind of an epidemic of mass proportion, and everyone who got it died. So people were freaked out, and anywhere you went, about a quarter to a third, maybe only a fifth of the people were wearing these masks. So everyone had heard this information. So I started to ask, well, where are these dead people? We haven't heard about anybody dying, and I don't see anybody sick in any special way that looks different from the common cold. So people insisted. I went to my office like, oh, we can't work because, you know, there's this plague. We could get infected or we could die. I said, listen, do you know anybody who died? Call around. So I had the people in the office call their families and their friends, say, do you know anybody who died? Call the local clinics. Is anybody coming in with deadly illness? The answer to all of these inquiries was no. One girl who lived in Kramatorsk, her aunt knew a lady, and that lady knew an old guy who had died. But it turns out he was quite old and he probably had the common cold. So then I did some calculations to calm the people in my office. I showed, listen, this is the population of Kramatorsk, this is the population of Slaviansk, and every year older people die because of the flu. And right now there's only one death, and there normally would be 3 by this time. So there's no epidemic, and in fact, somehow people are doing quite well. So this was the disinformation I heard. So now I became curious. So I asked, well, where are people getting these stories from? Where are people hearing it? Where are they getting it? Well, they're getting it from newspapers. I said, bring them to me. So we went and we found some papers, and these papers were all in Russian language. They were all Russian language gazettes, newspapers, flyers, and all of them were saying, and this is what they were saying, that the Americans had infiltrated Ukraine, and in every city in Ukraine they had secret biology laboratory research centers, and that they were creating some kind of a massive bioweapon to kill people and make them sick, and that this bioweapon was being tested in the area of Kramatorsk and Slaviansk because they wanted to see how good it worked, and that's why people were dying. And that's why all these people were wearing masks. There's nothing going on. It took 4 or 5 days until finally the local government said, listen, there's nothing to this. There's nothing going on. Nobody is dying. None of this is confirmed. It's a hoax. And people died off. But the thing is that this story about the American laboratories, that's not going to fade away. So now, the vlog post I saw yesterday, this guy supposedly had all these letters that were coming from like the biochemical terrorist faction of the U.S. Embassy, you know, in Kyiv, because every embassy has that, right? And it's these letters saying, oh, we want to come inspect your facility, and we want to... And this article, this guy, he was saying, hey, the Americans have overtaken all of the biology research centers. Listen, I've been to a school near here, a biology school near here. I went to see some lectures that were very interesting. There's no American presence there. This article said, so because the Americans are now everywhere, they have control of and access to the old biological warfare strains that the Soviets developed during the Cold War. And what we think, and then what this guy was heavily suggesting and outright claiming to be what's going to happen, he said that the Americans are going to then use this old Russian stuff, and they're going to commit a BioTerror act, and then they're going to blame the Russians on it and say, look, this strain was known to have belonged to the Russians. Of course, this is totally outlandish, because if such a thing did happen, of course the Russians would be the first one to be suspect. And then the next thought is, in Ukraine, they even made a movie about some old military officer in the Ukrainian army selling tanks and Kalashnikovs and everything else to any warlord with cash or diamonds in trade. So who's to say that bioweapons were not sold? And the other thing is that I know that the Russians never retired their bioweapons program. They just moved all of their scientists to Iran and set up shop there using agricultural facilities and this is that and this and that. And they have guys who just carry a briefcase with live samples from one lab to the other one, and that's how they're building a different kinds of bioweapons. And they have something that can kill. It's a virus. It's encapsulated, and they know how to store it and hybridize it so that they can put mass amounts of this in storage and then have a weapon of mass destruction. And I've also seen in many dreams that gas attacks and bioweapons and nerve agents are going to be used in the future warfare that's going to cover major portions of the world. Now I see there's a trend. It started years ago when I was in Slaviansk, and here it is 3 years later, and there's still these disinformation reports coming out that are easily confirmed to be false. The problem is not everyone, in fact, too few of people actually go out to fact check anything they hear. So the Russians are planting this disinformation, and then I suspect that they will cause some kind of a sickness, and then they are going to blame the United States. And the people who are just outright Russian, they're going to believe it. I'm telling you, when I was in Slaviansk, it was obvious to me that a lot of people were brainwashed. About half the people were pro-Russia. You got a sense of this very strongly, although they never said it out loud. And then you had the people who were pro-Ukraine. And on all the things that had happened in the city, there are always two stories. The Russian disinformation story, and then the truth. Here's a piece of truth that you won't read in the main media. Weapons were snuck into the city of Slaviansk and given to the men who came up the road from Kramatorsk, because from Slaviansk you have to go through Kramatorsk to get into the Russian-controlled areas. So that's where those people would come from. The road that comes out of the Russian-held territory, the road that the Russian, soldiers dressed in civilian clothes were coming down. So where do those weapons come from? In the main October Revolution Square, in the center of Slaviansk, there's one of those huge gold-domed Russian Orthodox churches. And the head priest from that church, he brought in a truck loaded with coffins, and he broke open the coffins, and they were loaded with machine guns, Kalashnikovs, ammunition, everything you'd want to start a small army. And those guys came in, and then they outlawed all drugs and alcohol, and they went to the drunk tanks and conscripted every drunk, they conscripted every drug user, and that's how they built their militia, just like that. These are the kind of shenanigans that are going on that you're not hearing about. And this is something the Holy Spirit has been showing you many, many times, that you have to have this strong relationship with God. You need to be seeking God, and you need to know His voice, because the disinformation is going to be so thick that you need to be able to hear from God, who's going to tell you what's true and what's deception and what's a lie and what kind of things the enemy is leading people into believing. This is a man from Modesto reminding you as always to pray or be defeated.